So we have Ben Hansberry, who is from Teaching and Learning Lab. He's the Associate Director of Graduate Student Teaching. We also have Tyler Smith here. They're all going to come up in a moment. And he is an instructor for TA training and for introductory biology. And Lauren Totino, who is our learning engineer at Open Learning Residential Education. So basically how today is going to work is they're going to come up, they're going to talk about what they do, and we'll learn about what each sort of group does, just to help understand how these different groups provide services to TAs, but also how we're a little bit different from each other as well. So, for example, TLL, helps with TA training across the institute. We have Tyler, who is a really good example of one department here at MIT who is doing a discipline-specific type training. And then we have resources from residential education, which is giving a lot more on the sort of tech related to pedagogy approaches to what you might need as a TA. So all that being said, we'll just start with presentations and we'll welcome up Ben.
So hi everybody, my name is Ben. I'm the Associate Director for Graduate Student Teaching at the Teaching and Learning Lab. That means that I run all of our graduate student facing programs. So that includes future faculty programs, so graduate students can build the skills that they're going to need to serve as faculty, either here at MIT or elsewhere after they leave us. But it also means that I support TA training. And so graduate students and undergraduates who serve as TAs, we have a variety of different programs that are designed to support their development, to support skill acquisition so that they can be effective TAs in their roles. The sort of main thing that we do that has to do with TA support is TA days. So TA days is our sort of beginning of every semester training sequence that we run sort of centrally through the TLL. It happens always during the last week of August or the last week of IAP. And since the pandemic, we've sort of developed a kind of mixed modality way of presenting TA days. So obviously during the pandemic, everything went online. And then as we've come back in person, we've really tried to assess for each workshop, is there a benefit to doing this in person, or can we still achieve the same goals and do it online? Because we know that a lot of graduate students may not be here at this time. Sometimes they're off doing research right up until the beginning of the semester, and we still like to try to make resources available to them. So for instance, our workshops about facilitating active learning in your recitation, those are in person because we want to demonstrate what it looks like to teach in that way. But workshops on, say, giving feedback on student writing may be still facilitated remotely so that we can create as many opportunities as possible. One of the nice things about TA Days is that while the majority of the workshops are facilitated by TLL staff, we also partner with other offices, Student Support and Wellbeing, IDHR, the Com Lab, which are able to sort of supplement the things that we're able to provide, but also provide a kind of platform and system for these departments to present workshops to maybe a larger audience than they might otherwise. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of the organization of the workshops that we have as part of TA Days. So the design is that all of the workshops are a la carte. We encourage TAs to to think about what their teaching responsibilities are going to be. If they know what they are, hopefully they do. And then look at the different workshops and think about which of these workshops is going to be most useful for me. Every once in a while, we get some frequent flyers who are there for like every single one, and we're very grateful for those folks. But we also know that, also from our personal experience, that workshop after workshop after workshop for 4 days in a row can be a lot. So we've set up a kind of flow chart that we include on the TA Days Canvas site to help TAs think about what their roles are and which of the workshops they'd like to come to. So first of all, we have a set of workshops that we basically recommend all TAs attend. These are our supporting student well-being workshop that we partner with Student Support and Wellbeing to facilitate. TAs as responsible employees, which we do with IDHR. And then we have two others, the inclusive teaching as a TA workshop, because we basically think there's no teaching context in which it's not relevant to think about inclusivity. And then also a pair of experienced TA panels. So we have one panel that focuses on School of Science and School of Engineering, and then another panel that focuses on SHOS, Architecture and Planning, and Sloan. And there we invite TAs who we know have been successful to basically just answer questions. From there, we ask TAs to start to think about what their role is going to be. So if they're primarily functioning as a grader, then we have a workshop that is about giving feedback, how to give effective feedback, how to give feedback that is going to facilitate learning. And then we'll also direct them to the Canvas resource, Canvas resource site, which we'll be hearing about in about 10 minutes. If there is interaction with students, then we ask them another question to think about what kind of interaction are you going to be doing. If you're going to be facilitating office hours, then we have a workshop on how to facilitate office hours effectively. If you're going to be leading a recitation, then we have a series of 3 workshops that can be taken independently, but all kind of hooked together to give them the skills that they would need to facilitate an effective recitation. And this consists of a workshop on getting students talking, how to encourage conversation amongst students, how to use examples effectively in a recitation context, and how to facilitate meaningful group work. Now, I know that one of the things that we're talking about here today is what TAs can do as they've developed as a TA. And someone might be thinking, oh, well, I really want to take advantage of these resources, but it's mid-semester. So what do I do now, since TA Days is only offered at the beginning of the semester? So there's a couple of different options, ways that we support TAs through the TLO. So first of all, if TAs are interested in sort of digging deeper into lesson planning, if they want to really sort of think a little bit more carefully about how they plan their recitations, if they have the latitude to do that, we have what we call a lesson planning track, which is 3 workshops on sort of how to scaffold a lesson plan, how to facilitate active learning, how to give effective feedback in person. If they're interested in practicing their teaching skills, we also have a microteaching track, which just wrapped up on Tuesday, where they will get together in small groups of 4 or 5, present a 10-minute teaching demo on some topic that might be a part of their TA assignment, and then receive feedback from me, from their peers. It's recorded, so horror, they can go and observe themselves teaching, which is always a really eye-opening, but we also think very effective way to learn about how you are as a teacher. If they're looking for some department-specific support, we have a program called the Teaching Development Fellows, and we would encourage TAs to reach out to their departmental teaching development fellow if that's something that they're interested in receiving more support on. These are graduate students who have been trained by the TLL and will do consultations. They might facilitate workshops. They're always interested to hear what the needs of the TAs are so that they can direct their programming and the resources that they design to support the TAs. And finally, the TLL itself offers observations and consultations on a one-on-one basis. And to access that, usually just email the TLL and you'll be set up with one of us so that we can figure out how we can help you. So I know I've gone past my time, so I'll turn it over to Tyler. Are you next?
Hi, I'm Tyler. I'm the instructor of TA training and biology in the bio department. And what I'm going to be talking about is really an initiative and program that was started by my predecessor, Dr. Summer Morrow, a few years ago, in terms of making a discipline-specific TA training program for our department. And I think the way I think about this is that really any class has these kind of 3 parties involved of teaching assistants, instructors, and students. And in the bio department, we ask our grad students to TA twice in their grad student career. Once in their 2nd year, once in their 4th year. And so the idea here is to give them kind of as part of this social contract of this work we're asking them to do for us, to give them really structured training and ongoing support as they carry out this teaching responsibility. And so there's a few avenues in which we approach this. One is that we've started deploying Instructor-TA Agreements. So these are sent out to all instructors that are teaching in a given semester before the semester starts. And we ask instructors to go through these forms and go through these kind of prompts with their TAs. And really I think the most important part of that is it kind of prompts the instructors and the teaching team to engage in a discussion of explicitly defining responsibilities and expectations. And the form actually walks them through, here are the expected responsibilities week to week, here are the expected number of hours, and I think importantly this also provides a framework that TAs can revisit mid-semester of, here's kind of the expectations we outlined at the beginning, the hours maybe we're finding we're putting in way more hours than expected, And that gives them a lever to kind of engage in a conversation of if there's anything that can be modified as the semester goes on. But really the heart of our program is this kind of weekly pedagogy training program. It's a series of workshops. It's spaced throughout the semester to kind of prevent just fire hosing TAs with a bunch of pedagogy. But it's meant to kind of meet their needs as they navigate the semester. So it starts with a 2-day orientation before the semester even starts, where we have presentations from IDHR, a stereotype threat training from Professor Kathy Drennan. And I think one thing I'd really like to highlight is that we give space for the TAs. I kind of try and recruit former TAs for each class, and current TAs will meet with former TAs in a facilitated discussion. And I actually do a small training with those facilitators beforehand on how to kind of walk these TAs through expectations for the semester, how to kind of define goals, and things to think about as they kind of navigate a similar class. And so then we have a set of 6 core sessions, 2 of which happen before the semester even starts. So before a TA even does their first recitation, they'll have gone through, or they can choose to go through 2 of these core sessions. And then the next 4 of the core sessions happen throughout the first 4 weeks of the semester. And we try and line up things like giving effective feedback. We try and line that up to around when the first problem sets are due in a semester, as well as supporting our students. We try and line up when around the first set of midterm exams happen. And so then to kind of cap that off, we also have a set of 5 kind of what we call special sessions. These are meant to be kind of principles of pedagogy that build off of these core concepts such as active learning, feedback, and these may or may not be, depending on your course, more or less relevant to a given TA. Some TAs do assessment design as part of their course of design problem sets. Some don't, so we try and let these be to kind of meet the demands as a TA sees fit. And then the last part of this is that we kind of have this ongoing workshop framework, but I also do kind of relatively early in the semester, I'm actually just wrapping these up now, I do teaching observations. So this is, I offer to come in, sit, watch the TAs give a recitation for an hour. I have a form that I fill out, and then I meet to debrief that form with TAs afterwards for about 30 minutes. And so this is meant to give them really practical feedback specifically about their recitation. I observe discussion-based recitations of like paper discussions. I observe kind of more traditional recitations. I observe lab TAs as well. And so that really allows me to kind of engage the TAs in a more specific dialogue as to how can we apply principles of pedagogy to their needs. And so, and we also then offer a kind of professional development certificate. If the TA completes the 6 core sessions, 1 special session, and they partake in an observation, we give them a biology pedagogy certificate to kind of signify professional development. And they can also use these workshops as counting towards their department required professional development hours as well. And so we've been measuring engagement in this, and in general, our first-time TA engagement is pretty good. Participated means they've gone to at least some part of this program, of the series of workshops or observations. And then roughly 40 to 50% of our first-time TAs are completing the certificate. And so we're hoping to continue increasing this. I will say the numbers aren't final yet, but fall 23 is looking like it might be our highest engagement so far. We'll see how the final numbers shake out. And we're now at the point in these semesters where actually we're getting, because TAs TA in their 2nd and their 4th year, we're now getting kind of our experienced TAs that went through the program in the spring of 21. We're getting, starting to get kind of TAs coming back to the program. And so what I'll kind of end with is just, I think the real advantages of kind of crafting this discipline-specific training is, 1, it allows us to tailor the content to the bio-TA experience. So a lot of the case studies we use in our workshops are specifically kind of bio-focused. We do scenarios for lab students. We do scenarios for traditional recitation students. But I personally think one of the probably the most powerful part is that we're able to integrate the program directly into the community. So I'm someone that's a very familiar face to all of the grad students. I run into a lot of the TAs in the hallway on my coffee breaks. And I'm just someone very familiar that they can just come to and talk to about any problem they're going through. And I think that's been a really kind of effective model to increase our engagement. And I'll just end with all of these materials can be found on MIT OpenCourseWare. My predecessor, Dr. Summer Morrow, put together this. It's fantastic. So if you'd like to check it out, those are all available. So yeah, and I'll pass it over to Lauren.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Totino. I'm a learning engineer on the residential education team, and a primary part of my role is to work with instructors and course teams to integrate technology into their Canvas sites and into their teaching practices. And by technology, I mean all of the tools that MIT supports at the Institute, the biggest one being Canvas is the LMS, and then all of the other tools that integrate with Canvas or just other digital technologies. So building off of all of the amazing work that TLL and departments like biology have done with supporting TAs, in the spring of 2022, we identified the opportunity to create a Canvas resources for TAs site built on Canvas to specifically support TAs with any of their responsibilities that involve technology. Again, Canvas is the big one, but also accounting for any other tools that they might incorporate into their TA responsibilities. So that's an important thing I want to highlight about the difference between this resources site and all of the resources that Ben and Tyler have talked about is we're specifically honing in on TA's interactions with technology. And so in the summer of 2022, we released this Canvas site. You see the QR code here for if you want to sign up to join the site. We enroll TAs with the student role on Canvas, or we also reach out to departments before every semester to see if they have a list of TAs who they know are assigned and want to add them to that. But basically, you engage with it at your own pace. You self-select to do it. No obligation to complete it in the way that a traditional training is. And so in that regard, we also sort of see this. We don't call it strictly a training. That's why we refer to it as more of a resources site, because the idea is you can go back to it at any point as like a just-in-time resource if you have a tech question or a certain challenge comes up maybe mid-semester and you're thinking that there's a certain tool or Canvas feature that might be able to help with that. And so the idea is that we are trying to account for TAs across the Institute. Again, that's kind of a key differentiator between what Tyler's doing over at Bio, which is more discipline specific. We are trying to cast a wider net and account for all of the immense variation among TAs at MIT while still being more pointed and kind of curated in our resources. So these are tailored to the responsibilities of a TA more so than just our general Canvas resources for instructors site, which many of you might be familiar with. So in terms of what's on this resources site, the front modules are addressing things that most TAs are probably going to experience if their responsibilities include working with Canvas. So that would be things that you do at the beginning of the semester or pre-semester, like getting yourself onto your courses site with the TA role, setting up the Canvas site, building it, designing it if that's something you're helping your course team with. And then from there, the way that we outline the rest of the tool-specific content is based on activities that TAs are likely to be engaging with. And a lot of that we learned from talking to TLL and Bio while designing this training so that we made sure that we were accounting for typical activities or experiences TAs would be encountering, but then thinking about it from our perspective of, well, how would you operationalize those teaching practices using technology? So that's sort of how we laid out the rest of the resources site, and we cover things like communicating with students, presentation and recitation tools, assessment, grading, and feedback is a big one. There's a lot of tools for that, discussion and collaboration, and video. And so those areas are more, they might not all apply to you. So again, that's sort of why we're not calling it a training. You engage with what you think is relevant to your course context. So I'm actually going to pop into the Canvas site itself. Maybe some of you have seen this already. So on the homepage, we outline all of those topics that I just talked about. We do recommend getting started with goals and outline because I think this is important for TAs to familiarize themselves, again, with the specific purpose of this resources site, right? It is about your responsibilities vis-a-vis technology. So if you're doing anything like managing a Canvas site or integrating tools as you're engaging with students, this is the place for you. And then I also wanted to highlight a few things, some features of the resources site itself that might be particularly helpful or might be a way that you would like to learn about the tools and about Canvas features. So video clips plays a pretty big role in how we've outlined the content on the site. So that I just pulled up an example of a page for learning about assignments in Canvas. And we actually don't have a lot of written content on here because we try to convey how a TA would use assignments in the MIT context specifically. So this demo clip that's embedded here is from our lovely colleague Meredith Davies. She's giving a demo, but it's specifically from more of the MIT Canvas instance perspective versus having TAs go out to like instructors' resources, which are a bit more general. So we're hoping that when you're learning about a tool for the first time, that TAs are able to connect more deeply in that way. And then another feature of our pages of content are what we call more to explore, which is this box that's at the bottom of pretty much every page. And they're basically just other resources for TAs to engage with if they think that this is a tool that they're going to use. So again, in trying to account for the vast variation among TAs at MIT, we understand that we're not going to build every single piece of content into our resources pages here. Might not be relevant, but it might be super relevant to other TAs. And so if they want to see, this example is about Perusal, which is one of the LTIs that integrates into Canvas. If they wanted to see examples from other instructors using Perusal at MIT, they could go watch these xTalk videos or read about other examples from Residential Digital Innovations. So that element kind of lends some flexibility to how TAs are engaging with this site. And then to add a little bit of activity in here, we also have a few what we're calling like exercises or practice opportunities. One of them is getting them to actually practice submitting an assignment, which seems like why would a TA be doing that? But the strategy behind this is that if a TA isn't super familiar with Canvas, we're having them sort of take a look at what it looks like from the student point of view to open up an assignment, submit it. Maybe there's a rubric in there, kind of understanding that student point of view. But then immediately after they kind of run through this exercise, it goes into content on what the related TA activity is following that. So it goes into grading and using SpeedGrader. So we're trying to get them practice in the sense of seeing all sides of what's going on in a system like Canvas. And then jumping back to the Perusal page for a second, one really important thing I want to highlight is we are talking about technology, so it seems like maybe you're wondering, oh, so is the content like super technical? It's just like the hard and fast steps of enabling a tool on a Canvas site. We do account for that, but we also are trying to weave a bit more of the pedagogy in here with sections that are, how can X tool help with teaching and learning? So we really are hoping that that section of this content helps TAs decide whether or not a certain tool is relevant to their context or might be helpful and kind of maybe help make those decisions, or more likely it's that the whole course team or them in conversation with their instructor are making these types of decisions. So this is where, I had said earlier, we're looking to, departments like TLL and Bio to understand what our TA is doing, and then we're kind of taking it from there to see, okay, well, how can they operationalize those things with technology? So if you know of any TAs who are not familiar with the site, again, there's the QR code. They can sign up and I'll enroll them. Yeah, thank you.
So we'll just kind of jump into discussion. Feel free if you have a question to chime in, but I'll just open up with a couple of things. So I think that, first of all, thank you all for presenting a little bit about what it is that you are providing to TAs. I think it's really helpful. And it's really interesting to see the range of resources, both from like pre-semester and during semester, right, including courses and even observations. What I'm really curious about is, from your experience, is there certain things that TAs outside of these resources might typically come to you for, or that you hope they would come to you more for, based on conversations you've had with instructors or TAs?
Yeah, I can start. I think one thing that we've really been trying to push TAs to is like reaching that goal of 20 hours a week is kind of what the bio department has set as the expectation of the average week of work a TA does. And I think one thing a lot of TAs I've seen struggle with is a big time sink is recitation prep. And so I give them workshops on how to design things with proper pedagogy. But I find like TAs really struggle with like designing practice problems. And there's a lot of things TAs can do to streamline that. And so that's one thing I would really encourage TAs to like come talk to me about. If they find like they're spending, I've talked to TAs before where they're like, I'm spending 8 hours prepping for a 1 hour recitation. And so I think that's somewhere where like, just engaging in that discussion of like, how can we, what's your process and how can we streamline that? Because I think TAs often just kind of flounder with that for a whole semester, and that can be really taxing long term too, and overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think that, when you're talking about, especially if they haven't been encouraged to or haven't sought out that support at the beginning of the semester, there may be kind of reinventing the wheel. And if you are trying to figure out for yourself how to write a good problem set, for instance, instead of seek out these other resources, it may be because they don't know that those resources are there. They may not realize that they're there to help them. They may have forgotten from the deluge of emails that they get of letting them know about all these awesome programs at the beginning of the semester. By the time they're designing problem sets in week 4, it may not even occur to them to seek us out. So I think that finding those opportunities, and I think we see this with the problem sets that you're talking about, other aspects of recitation planning. I think there are a lot of places where seeking out support somehow will help them sort of save time in the long run, even if it means spending an hour or two learning a skill that you're not going to necessarily use tomorrow in recitation, but will be useful for you over the course of the semester.
I think the residential team would encourage TAs to come to us for the very same things that instructors and faculty come to us for, which would be, pre-semester things like getting your Canvas site set up, or if you want to take a new approach to designing it, any other sort of like learning design consultation, or super technical things like you do want to integrate a new LTI for the first time and you want some assistance getting it set up. So all of the same things, the same kind of interactions that we have with other instructors and faculty, we would encourage TAs to do the same, especially if they know going into their course that they're going to have a lot of responsibilities or they're going to be the key person who's in charge of managing Canvas. We'd want them to get comfortable with that, or that set of responsibilities sort of pre-semester. But then for anything else, mid-semester, again, we encourage you going to the site as sort of a just-in-time resource, or reaching out, like if there's a particular challenge and you need to integrate some sort of tool, maybe it's GradeScope mid-semester, because that's drastically going to help you with grading your midterms and any other assessment that comes after that. That's sort of where we would step in to facilitate that process, because we know could be kind of a big pivot to make mid-semester. And then toward the end of the semester, if you're interested in, or I guess this could happen at any point, but if you're interested in looking at any data from the tools you're using, whether it's Canvas or any LTIs, we would love to walk you through, what you're seeing, what you could do with that to make further improvements to a future course. But yeah, basically anything that we already work with instructors on. If TAs are that highly involved, we want them to be comfortable with the technology.
You're talking about like beginning, like mid-semester and end of semester. I think another thing that would be a really easy thing for a lot of TAs to implement would be some sort of mid-semester feedback opportunity for their students. And I think that will really help them, depending on how they're running the recitations, that can be an opportunity to find out, like, how's it going in the room? What are the students liking? What are they finding to be more of a challenge? And then, with all that information, you can then maybe make some smarter decisions about how you plan your recitations.
Yeah, and kind of going off of what you're just mentioning, Ben, in terms of like thinking outside of the responsibilities you have as a TA, like looking for signs of when students may be in need of extra support, or even when an instructor may be hoping for you to help flag certain things. I mean, how do you kind of navigate that as a TA? Like, what advice maybe do you have? Like the mid-semester evaluation is one way to kind of get that idea, but are there other things that maybe you folks recommend or have seen folks do well?
So I think the challenge is that the way to do that well is going to be really context specific. I think hopefully if the concern is about like students falling behind or students not really falling behind, then I think hopefully there's a conversation that's being had between the instructor and the TA about like what constitutes falling behind, what the various options are going to be, so that it's not like, oh, surprise, so-and-so hasn't come to class for 6 weeks, let's figure out what to do. But that can be some planning in advance of that. I think that would, and then, if that hasn't been done, then I think it really, I guess, if someone was coming to me with that problem, it would really have to be on a kind of case-by-case basis in terms of what's reasonable given the course, given the number of students in the course, given the workload of the student, what other resources are available, and so on.
Yeah, I think to kind of bounce off that, like I work very closely with Dr. Bello as a course coordinator, and like we can see grade books and we can certainly flag students when grades are not where the student would probably want them to be, or if grades start suffering suddenly. I think the thing we really try and tell TAs that like the role TAs play in that is really looking for more the like changes in pattern of behavior, because we're not seeing these students, especially with things like 701 or in the spring I work with 705, these classes are over 100 students, right? Like, so it's really important, like if the TAs notice something in recitation, that's the real value they have in terms of like spotting students that might be struggling or need some type of help.
And in the TA Days curriculum, that's really what the student support and well-being workshop is mostly about, is like how to notice like when there's a change in behavior for TAs, if there's a concern that there may be an emotional thing or something like that, so that you can direct them to the right resources. Because I think that's another thing for new TAs especially, they may not be familiar of the kind of constellation of resources that exist to help students. And what I always tell TAs is, it's not your job to fully understand the constellation. We all know each other, so just reach out to one of us. And if we're not the person to talk to, we'll tell you who the person is to talk to. But I think in situations like that, time really can be of the essence.
Thinking both from a TA perspective and even from instructor working with TAs, do you have like top 1 or 2 advice things to think about, at this point in the semester that you think is helpful for folks to know about?
So based on what Ben was saying about mid-semester evaluations, I think sort of the tech side of that would be doing some sort of similar, like even just a little pulse check on how students are feeling about the different pieces of Canvas or other tools that they're interacting with. And I think it's up to the TA and the teaching team when they get that feedback to understand, is this something that, we need to make a change, but it's so big we probably shouldn't do it mid-semester, or is it kind of low-hanging fruit, like a quick pivot that they can make where they actually are being quite responsive to whatever feedback they're getting from that pulse check. So I would say if there's anything that you can, even just casually asking, if they're having trouble finding a certain assignment on Canvas, or even, without having to ask for it, maybe they're already hearing feedback from students about like, I had a really hard time navigating this part of the Canvas site, or I couldn't access this resource. Just little things that, if you're already in Canvas maintaining and uploading new things, you can go in and kind of make some tweaks. But that said, if you're hearing anything that kind of is going to result in some bigger change or improvement, that's when we'd recommend reaching out. We'd be happy to work with any teams on, kind of making a bigger iteration to Canvas or whatever you're incorporating in your teaching.
So I think, we're in the middle of the semester right now, and I think it's very easy at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester to do some big picture thinking to help students situate the things that they're learning day to day within some broader framework. But like when you're in the midst of it, sometimes it can be lost, especially with midterms coming up and you're thinking about sort of day to day. So I guess if there's something I would encourage TAs and instructors to think about now, is to see if there are opportunities, if this isn't a part of your regular teaching practice, to help students resituate themselves in that broader context of their course, whether this is the learning outcomes that you have in mind, how what we're learning in this course fits into broader questions within the discipline, because I think that the midterm especially can be a place where it can be easy to lose sight of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think for TAs, I think we're kind of at the mid-semester point. I think often it's easy to kind of fall into a habit. This is one reason why this semester I pushed up when I do observations, because I think like an important part of teaching is iteration. And so one thing I kind of try and push TAs to do is like keep iterating. And it doesn't need to be, you don't need to like overhaul how you run your recitation, but like just try a different activity, try something new. And I think like as well to that point of like, if you find you're still, you feel like you're doing way too much work still, or it's taking too much time, like continue to like reach out for help, right? And don't just kind of accept it for the rest of the semester, and then the semester goes by and you're completely burnt out. I think, one thing I also do with TAs is sometimes I'll do conflict coaching as well. If they feel they're like overburdened in their course, I'll coach them through how do you engage your instructor or your professor in a good faith conversation to talk about that. And because often, the professors aren't trying to overwork them often, it's just they don't realize the work the TAs are putting in. So I'll do conflict coaching. I think on the instructor side of things, that instructors and professors should keep in mind is to maintain communication with your teaching team. I think it's really easy in this kind of mid-semester now, we're in the grind, to kind of go on autopilot and forget to check in with your TA team, or not put as much conscious effort into that. And that's often when tension can grow if you don't constantly if you're not constantly facilitating that team environment. So that's one thing I would really like kind of instructors and teaching staff to keep in mind as the semester grinds on.
Yeah, the answer I was going to give until you said this point in the semester was to signal boost the idea of having an agreement between the instructor and the TA so that those lines of communication are open. Because very rarely are the instructors don't care if the TAs are feeling overworked. Almost always the instructor is thinking, well, the TA will reach out to me if they're overworked, if they're having problems. So I'm ready to respond. But I'm not going to respond until I get that reach out. And then the TA is thinking, oh, I'm really overwhelmed. I'm not allowed to reach out, or they must know what I'm going through, and so they would be taking proactive action. And so there's that lack of communication. So I think you're right. If you've started to develop those norms, to sort of not let them slip as you sort of settle into a groove.
A question I have for my fellow panelists is thinking about the TA community side of support, so that you can go to folks like us for support, but I've always been curious about TAs sort of going to each other, whether it's directly in their department, which I think is the most immediate and makes sense, but also just maybe even more broadly across the institute. And I'm thinking of it from the perspective of, I think it might be nice as for a future iteration to the Canvas resources site to maybe build in some more element of community so TAs can talk about any challenges or questions they have, again, specifically regarding Canvas and technology, but just kind of fostering that environment of they have each other to turn to for certain things. So I'm wondering if either of you are already fostering community in that way amongst TAs.
So this is an explicit goal of the Teaching Development Fellows Network. The sort of two goals of that program are to sort of disseminate some of the things that we know about effective teaching and learning, but also to, what I say is, build a culture of reflective teaching in the departments. And what that specifically looks like is really going to depend on the culture of that department. In some departments, it's very easy to just sort of set up in the student lounge one day and start talking to your colleagues about teaching, and the culture of the department is such that then people are going to kind of get in on the conversation. Sometimes you really have to plan something and bribe people by ordering pizza to show up and have a conversation. And sometimes an in-person thing isn't the best way to do it. Thinking about, okay, are there ways to distribute resources or reach out in other ways? Some people have used Slack or other tools to do that. So I think it really depends on the department. And the teaching development fellows, we really sort of say, your department better than I do. So you figure out what is going to be the best way, in conversation with other fellows.
Yeah, this is an ongoing goal for me because I think so this semester, for example, I tried for the first time TA kind of study hall or office hours, which was a dedicated time where I block off a room and I tell the TAs, you can come ask me questions if you're prepping for your recitation for next week. You can come and work with each other. Those have not been well attended. So I don't know if I really achieved the goal, but it is something I'm actively thinking about of how can I get more. And it's hard to know because I've talked to a few TAs one-on-one, and I think a lot of this kind of happens within course teams, where I talked to one TA and they were well, we already kind of outside of structured hours, we collaborate a lot. And so they're kind of doing it on their own. So I think one thing I'm really thinking about is, is there a kind of structured version of that TAs find valuable? I think the challenge with, grad students that I was a grad student not too long ago that I'm very mindful of. They're very busy people, and they all have different schedules. They're doing different types of experiments that have different weird office things. So it's like hard to have a single block of time that works. But it's something I'm kind of actively thinking about. So if anyone has good ideas, please let me know.
You mentioned that some of it is already happening amongst course teams, and I wonder if it might assuage some of our concern that it isn't happening, to see if we could collect some information about that. Find out hey, are you talking with people in your course team? Because it may be that we don't really have to do that much to build that community, and indeed it would be better if it came out more organically out of their relationships, instead of being I'm the person who's charged with helping you, so I'm going to help you in these specific ways that I reckon are going to be the best, whether or not you think the same.
Yeah, and the ones I actually really worry about too is the course teams that only have one TA, right? And I think those also tend to be upper division courses, which are smaller, which also tend to be fourth year and above grad students who kind of anyone that's worked with grad student and getting them to turn out to things. There's a really sharp drop off after 30 years. So that's kind of a population that's really hard to engage, is upper year grad students. And so I think, this might be somewhere where we maybe need to think about some of the post-semester surveys we already do, of kind of including some things along this line.
Yeah, and I kind of want to throw this question out to everyone here. I mean, anyone who's a TA or instructor, I mean, do you have ideas or challenges that you've been facing in your experience, or certain things that are going really well? We would really like to hear from you if anyone's willing to share.
The person in back said that it's been going really well. People have been close. They've been able to answer questions. Can you, as you think about your experience, say anything about what do you think contributes to that? So for the sake of the recording, the response was that it's sort of happened organically, but I think if I can draw something in particular out, that there are different folks with different sets of expertise, and so there's a kind of intellectual reason to rely on each other, and that has sort of manifested into also social reliance and things like that. That's wonderful.
Well, I think we'll conclude our panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you all for your time. And we'll be around the room for just a little while more if anyone wants to stick around and chat. And just a quick closing for TAs and instructors as well. An opportunity that we at Residential Education are providing for TAs to, if you want to have practice and experience sharing the work that you do as a TA, we're going to have a TA showcase that you can apply to participate in. Fully optional, but it's going to be part of our annual Festival of Learning, which typically takes place at the end of IAP. So if that is of interest to you, please let us know. I have some handouts here I can give you with information. And otherwise, thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.